The story of how I met my husband is really a story about the kinds of things that can happen when you really break out of your comfort zone and take risks and risk being vulnerable. It's also a story about travel and parkour. So check it out. Hi, I'm Leslie, and I am a life coach based here in Brisbane, Australia. And before I moved to Brisbane, I lived in Melbourne. I lived in Melbourne for about 4.5 years before moving here. And before I moved to Melbourne, I was living in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Now, when I first moved to Melbourne, it was a really tricky adjustment. From having lived in Asia for a couple of years to suddenly living in a place that was a lot quieter, a lot more, just very, very different from Ho Chi Minh City. In fact, it took probably a good solid year to feel like I had my own life there. I was in a relationship at the time with a guy I met in Cambodia while I was traveling through Cambodia during my time living in Vietnam. And long story short, we met. He was from Melbourne. I ended up moving to Melbourne like a year or so afterwards. And I felt like most of my friends and my activities and things that I got involved in were sort of his things with his friends or his colleagues. I really wanted a life of my own in Melbourne. So I was after two things. I wanted to become more physically fit, and I wanted to be around people that were not directly in that circle that I had found myself in. So I hopped onto Google and literally looked for things to do in Melbourne. Somehow, by chance, I ended up on some random forum about, I think, like adventurous first dates or something. And someone mentioned something about parkour. Now, I had a vague familiarity with what that was, but then I looked deeper into it, found that there was a community in Melbourne that was offering parkour classes. I looked at that and I said, there's no way I can do that. I was so unfit at the time. I think I was 28 years old or 29. Very overweight, very uncoordinated, and I was like, no. Actually, why not? That's what I said to myself, because I've always been up for a challenge. I was concerned about my lack of upper body strength, first and foremost, so I posted something on the Australian Parkour Association's community forum that was titled Overweight, Lacking Upper Body Strength. Asking, these are my stats, I don't feel like I'm up for this, but what should I do to prepare? It was that kind of thing. So I got a couple of responses. One was from one of the instructors saying, you'll be fine for a first-timers class, everyone develops at their own pace. So I thought, you know what, why not? What do I have to lose? I went to a class. I thought, this is insane, I can't do this. I was so sore for a good solid week or so afterwards. Couldn't keep up with anyone. A lot of these were very fit young guys, much younger than me, much stronger, fitter. But I have this philosophy that anything worth trying once is worth trying twice. So I went back a second time. I told myself that even if I were feeling really, out of place or out of my depth, that I really didn't have anything to lose by going and trying again and seeing what I could do week after week. consistently, every time I went, I struggled a lot. To some people, it may have seemed like a joke that I was there at all and that I just kept coming back. But I eventually fell in love with it for what it did for my own individual development. And it got me out of the house on a Sunday. It was a great way to explore the city and just play. And after a while, I really felt like a part of that community. I felt like a valued and appreciated part of that community. I made really good friends. And that community is really one of the primary reasons I stayed in Australia at all. Because my relationship at the time was actually quite emotionally abusive. There, I've said it. But I was in it. So, that community is what kept me in Australia. And every year, the Australian Parkour Association has a national gathering in a different city in Australia. The first year that I started, the NatGat, National Gathering, was in Melbourne. The next one that I went to was in Sydney. And the one after that was in Townsville/Magnetic Island. So that's here in Queensland, it's further north. So at this point, I still did not have amazing parkour skills, but I was attending these national gatherings, surrounded by people from all over the country, some people who would travel in from other countries even, who just had these amazing physical abilities. I just found really energizing. You know, it didn't matter that I couldn't scale a wall the way someone did, or, vault over everything with ease the way other people did. It didn't frighten me. It got me excited, even though I knew that it was quite unlikely I was ever going to reach that physical capability. It was still so good to be around that kind of vibe, So, at one of the national gatherings, the one in Townsville, in 2012, I had traveled up there with my friends Amy and Tony. One morning, we went to our designated meeting spot, and there was this guy there. This guy was also named Tony. He was tall, he had this yellow t-shirt on, had these lovely, strong shoulders, and the most amazing smile. It was adorable. And I had seen him before. I had seen heaps of photos of him with my other parkour friends. He was just this really hot guy in my friends' Facebook pictures, and then there he was in person. And I remembered seeing him in Sydney, and also he had also traveled back and forth between Brisbane and Melbourne for parkour things. But we hadn't actually met at that stage. We hadn't met until that moment in 2012. And he looked at me and he said, "Hi, Leslie." And I was like, "Hi." And I just kind of slinked away, because I thought, oh, well, here's this very attractive young man, and he knows my name somehow. And I don't know, I got a bit shy. But I had a boyfriend. I didn't want to have this boyfriend anymore. I had been emotionally abused for about, 3.5 years at this point. So I thought, okay, hot guy, leave it at that, look but don't touch, behave myself, yada yada. He was actually going by the name Nyagi at the time. We went out and did all these really amazing things. Of course, I usually was dead last in the physical exercises we were doing, but that was fine, because I wasn't there to compete with anyone, except maybe myself. And This was while we were still in Townsville. So we went out to Magnetic Island, which was a beautiful place. It's beautiful. And we were staying in a place where they do school camps. And we had one of the events for this national gathering was sunrise bouldering. Bouldering? Boulder hopping. Boulder... Anyway. So, I wake up. It's still dark out. Of course, the sun hasn't risen. And on the door of the little room where I was staying with some other people, there was this knock. And this guy, again, with this really big smile and this funny floppy hat, he's knocking on the door and he's like, "Hi." And I was like, who looks like that at 4 a.m? Like, I'm exhausted. Like, what's wrong with you? Anyway, this guy was Tony. So I thought, okay, gorgeous, attractive man, I will follow you to the beach. Because that's what you do when you've got this gorgeous guy knocking on your door at 4 a.m. saying, "Hi, come to the beach with me." So the group jogged on to the beach where the boulders were. And I, of course, was the very last person in the group. Everyone was just skittering along as the sun was rising. And I was trying to climb and hop and jump from boulder to boulder, just at my own pace. I was quite happy to do this at my own pace. My friend Brett was there as well, so we helped each other not get completely lost, which was quite nice. I think I was more in danger of that than Brett was. And Tony was hanging around the periphery. Tony was actually one of the organizers of the event that year. That was also the year when he became the president of the Australian Parkour Association. So of course he wanted to make sure that no one was going to be left behind, no one was going to get lost or injured or killed, whatever the case may be. So being the slowest one in the group, I got to spend a bit of time with Tony. We got to know each other a little bit, but it was really more of that kind of entertaining each other stage. He was jumping over things, he was doing these jumps that I just could not relate to. He was eating green ants, just snacking on them, just picking them up off of rocks. And I just found that fascinating. So we eventually, we never caught up with the group. They had already gone back to where we were staying, and they were starting breakfast. They were miles ahead of where we were. So we got to the end point. We met everyone for breakfast. We kind of parted ways for that time being. And then that evening, we had a bonfire on the beach. And it was incredible. It was just so much fun because I was there with these people who I just absolutely loved. Just being young and free and happy and being out in nature and having this wonderful fire in front of us. So at this amazing bonfire, I was still mindful of the fact that I was kind of trying to avoid this hot Nyagi Tony guy. Because remember, I still had a boyfriend. And then I heard Tony say, "Well, you can sit over here." I didn't realize it was him at first. And then when I saw it was him, I was like, oh, it's that guy. I'm trying to avoid him. But I can't just say, oh no, I'm not gonna sit there. So I sat down. We shared a bottle of pink Moscato. We talked and he gave me a back massage and a head rub. And we just really bonded. After the bonfire, we all went back to camp and parted ways for the evening. The next day, a group of us were hanging out together a lot of the day. And in the evening, Tony invited us to go see the little campsite that he had set up, because at this point we had moved out of the dormitory camp area and into various hostels and hotels and wherever else people were staying. But he and our friend Dave had set up a little campsite just off in some woody bouldery area with a fire and all of that, sleeping on hammocks. It was lovely. He invited us to come out to see it. My other friends, well, Amy and Tony, they decided to just go straight back to the hostel, go to sleep. So I said, okay, why not? I'll come have a look at this campsite you've set up. And it became just a couple of hours of me and Tony just talking about everything. We talked about relationships, we talked about life, we talked about our hopes and dreams. And I reached this point where I realized, I said, wow, I'm stuck in a relationship that is just draining me, absolutely draining me, and I'm wasting my time because there are people like this guy in the world. And at that point, I would have been satisfied just finding someone half as amazing as Tony was. And that meeting, or that evening with Tony, was really the catalyst for making that leap to finally fly back to Melbourne and say, look, I can't do this anymore, to my boyfriend. By the time the breakup conversation happened, Tony and I had exchanged some messages and had maybe a phone call or two, so he knew that it was gonna happen. We didn't have any plans to get together at the time, but I had my phone, I was wearing my bathrobe, and I had my phone in my pocket. I had my hand on that pocket because I didn't want to back out of the breakup. I had tried to break up with this guy once before, and I backed out. So this time, I knew that I wouldn't. And I had friends, parkour friends, who had been waiting and waiting and waiting for this breakup to happen because they knew how miserable I was and how much it was draining me. And they were ready to take me in, to give me a place to live after it happened. So I had to muster up all of that energy and all of that knowledge and really finally just say, look, it's over. It's been bad for a long time. I can't do this anymore. The ex did not take it well. At one stage, he had to go into another room for something. And while he was out of the room, I picked up my phone. I sent a text message to Tony and I said, it's happening. The breakup is happening right now. And then I put my phone back in my pocket just in time for the other guy to come back in. And that was it. By the end of the conversation, I was free. It was sad, but it was very necessary. Very necessary. And then I called my friend Chippa. I was like, Chippa, can I come live with you now? And of course his response was, yes. Because he'd been waiting for that call. And I moved out of the place where I was living with the ex, and I moved into the warehouse where we did our parkour training. That's where Chippa was living at the time. And I lived there for just over a year, I think. Living in the warehouse was just such an amazing experience. My friends were there a lot. It was a very casual drop-in sort of situation, which I normally don't like, but I liked it in this situation. People would just show up. We did our indoor parkour classes there, so I got to participate in those sometimes, and it was also a stunt training facility. So every Saturday morning, I'd wake up look out my window, look down at the training floor, and there were people just doing amazing feats of strength and agility and stunty things. Tony would come to visit a lot partly because he was, at that point, still the president of the association. So flying back and forth between Brisbane and Melbourne was a thing that happened sometimes. I went to visit Brisbane a couple of times, and it was during one of my visits to Brisbane that we finally got our act together and we became an official couple. 5 months later, we were engaged to be married, and just under a year later, we were married. We had one wedding in Brisbane and another wedding in Peru. A number of our wedding guests in Brisbane, well, a lot of them were from our parkour communities, so from Brisbane parkour, Melbourne parkour, and some of them even came over for the wedding in Peru, which was just amazing. It was so wonderful having like some of my favorite people in the world all in this one really magical place with my Peruvian family. And when I look at Tony and I look at our situation, I look at our marriage, and I think, man, when I was looking at things to do in Melbourne, found parkour, and thought, oh, I could never do this. If I had given in to that feeling, I would not be living in Brisbane with an amazing man and an amazing daughter who is also very much a parkour kid. If I had given up during all those moments where I thought, this was a ridiculous idea, I'm exhausted, I'm sweaty, I'm smelly, I'm slower than everyone else, if I had backed out of doing the sunrise boulder hopping that morning on Magnetic Island because I knew I was going to be the last one, none of that would have happened. My life would look so different now. And it's those moments where you have opportunities to challenge yourself and to grow that are really the ones that are most likely to just change your life. When you're afraid to step out of your comfort zone, or you're afraid to be vulnerable, you're afraid to look silly, or you're afraid to get dirty or whatever it might be, and if you want to make a change in your life, you have to be willing to accept that there will be moments of discomfort. There will be moments where you just want to give up. And I'm just so glad that I didn't. Choosing not to give up has brought so much richness and variety into my life. And, Tony and I are still part of this amazing parkour family. And in 2016, actually 2 weeks after my daughter was born, we had our national gathering in Brisbane. I was one of the organizers. And there was a moment during that gathering where I was there holding my tiny little baby, my tiny 2-week-old newborn, who was wearing an Australian Parkour Association custom-made onesie. And I had this moment. I was like, oh my goodness. All of this has resulted from my refusal to give up when I felt uncomfortable. When I went to those classes and was like dead last doing everything, dead last in our runs, I was always that person being guided by the instructor who was bringing up the rear. I eventually became an instructor, still never having developed all the amazing abilities that these people who inspired me had, but that didn't matter because I wasn't competing with them. But if I had given in to that feeling like I wasn't good enough or I didn't deserve to be there, have had that moment. So the main lesson that I would like you to take away from my story is that when you feel that moment, when you're trying to achieve something or just trying to break out of a situation, when you feel that resistance, push through it. Because whatever's on the other side, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, is going to grow you a lot more than just staying in place and accepting your situation, however dissatisfying it might be. And if that feeling of breaking free from something is something that you want to discuss further with me, come have a chat. Go to my website, leslievcoaching.com. You can book in to see me in the studio, or we can chat online. Follow me on my socials, subscribe to my channel, get in touch, because I'd love to hear from you. All right, have an awesome week, and I'll see you next time.